Hi, everyone. Welcome to the National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems November webinar, Trauma-Informed Person-Centered Thinking and Support. We're glad to have you here, and we will give folks a few moments to gather. I will be pasting some logistical details into chat for everyone to see. And these include a link to download the slides if you wish to download slides and view them alongside the presentation. We also need to let you know that this webinar is being recorded now, and the recording will be posted along with the slides on our website, ncaps.acl.gov, within a couple of weeks of this webinar. The webinar is also being captioned in English and Spanish. If you'd like to access the Spanish captioning, there's a link in chat that you can click on to access that, and that'll come up in a separate window. All webinar attendees are muted, but please do feel free to announce yourself in chat and to engage with us as the presentation continues. So we'll give folks just one more moment to gather, and then we'll get started. Connor, if you want to go to the next slide. Great, so thanks everybody. We're very excited for you to be here. We're going to learn today about the intersection of trauma-informed approaches and person-centered supports. This is a monthly webinar series sponsored by NCAPS, the National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems. We are pleased to be funded by the Administration for Community Living and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, administered here at the Human Services Research Institute. I am Bevan Cruft. I am co-director of NCAPS at the Human Services Research Institute, and it's great to have everybody here. Let's go to the next slide. Run through some. Before I run through logistics one more time, let's all remember the goals of NCAPS, and that's to promote systems change that makes person-centered principles not just an aspiration, but a reality in the lives of people across the lifespan. We're just entering into the second year of NCAPS. We have been doing lots of exciting work, and this webinar is really part of our work, and really getting down to understanding how person-centered principles intersect and interact with trauma-informed principles. Next slide, please. Here's some more logistics one more time. I will periodically paste these logistics into chat so that you have access to the live links. But I'll just run through them here with everyone as well. You are all muted during this webinar. There are hundreds of participants joining us today. So we will rely on the chat feature in Zoom to post questions and then also to communicate with the hosts. If you'd like to post a question to the entire community, to all folks on the webinar, feel free to select all panelists and attendees, and your question will go out to the community. You're welcome to use chat to engage with your fellow participants in that way. If you'd like to ask a question just to panelists, then you can select all panelists. And then if you'd like to chat privately with one of the speakers, including myself, you can also select that option. So please do use chat to engage with us in this webinar. We will also have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. So the questions that you enter into chat or into the Q&A pod, either one is fine. I'll be keeping track of those, and we'll get to as many as we're able at the end of the presentations. This webinar is being live captioned in English and Spanish, and to access Spanish captions, you can click on the link, which is in your chat box and also here on your screen. That will pop up an additional window with a live captioning in Spanish. And just to let you know also, at the end of the webinar, there will be real-time evaluation questions that will come up as polls, and we'll leave you just a moment to do that towards the end. The slides are available to you now. If you would like to download them, they are accessible. So if you're using JAWS or a screen reader, you should be able to follow along that way. They're available on the link in chat. And also, the recording, slides, everything will be available publicly on our website, ncaps.acl.gov, after the webinar. And you can always get in touch with us at our email address, but just note that that's not being monitored during the webinar. If you need to get in touch with us during the webinar, please use chat. Okay, next slide, please. So now I'm pleased to introduce our illustrious panel of speakers this afternoon. First, we'll hear from Karen Harvey. She has worked in the field of intellectual disabilities as a psychologist for over 30 years, has published 2 books on the topic of trauma and intellectual disabilities. Karen's 3rd book, Trauma and Healing, is coming out very soon in the beginning of next year. Next, we'll hear from Tanya Richmond. Tanya is a partner with Support Development Associates, and she has over 30 years of experience as a licensed clinical social worker, diverse expertise in direct practice, and has directed programming and evaluative agencies and community service agencies, community college, and Research One university settings. After Tanya, we'll hear from Amy Ortiz-Day. She's the mother of 2 teenagers who are adventurous, funny, kind, and have a disability. She joined the Center on Disability and Development at Texas A&M in 2014 and manages several programs that support person-centered practices, increase self-advocacy, and promote the inclusion of people with disabilities in their communities. And then finally, we'll hear from Kathy Cave, a founding partner of Inspired Vision LLC. Kathy has over 30 years of experience in culture, inclusion, and disparities elimination, trauma-informed services and supports, peer support, and strength-based approaches. She uses her survivor, family, community, provider, and administrator perspectives to facilitate organizational change at local, state, and national levels. So we're just very excited to be presenting this to you today, and I will first turn things over to Karen.
Thank you so much. This is such an honor, and I'm really excited about this. NCAPS is a great organization. Already you've made a major impact, and these training opportunities that you've been providing us are just fantastic. I'm also very honored to be a part of this esteemed panel. I have presented before with Tanya and Amy, and they both just blow me away, and I'm excited to hear everything Kathy has to say and to really learn. I just feel so privileged to be a part of this and all the work that Bevan and the others have done. I really, really appreciate. So I just want to say that first, and what an honor it is. So next slide. You know, in the world that I'm in of disabilities, you know, I've been working over 30 years in the disability world. And, you know, at first it was shocking when I first started working in this field, because I would say, you know, I think these guys need therapy. I think folks can really benefit from therapy. And I was told over and over again by psychologists, by psychiatrists, oh no, you can't do therapy with people with disabilities. Intellectual disabilities, no, they don't respond to therapy. And I was like, oh my goodness, I think they need it more than anyone else. It's so hard to be in this world. It's so hard to be in this world and to be labeled with an intellectual disability, to be struggling and to be so smart, because everyone I know with an intellectual disability is really smart and has such a whole treasure chest of things to offer within them, and are discounted in many situations in so many ways. So that made me go back to school. So I had to borrow money and be tortured. I wasn't really that excited about having to go back to school, but I did. And I said, well, I need people to listen to me. And so I went back and was able to get my PhD and start doing therapy and train people to do therapy with folks with intellectual disabilities. And what we heard, next slide, was one trauma story after another. And I know that today, when I say this to all of you, those of you working in the disabilities field with folks with intellectual disabilities, and that's specifically what I'm addressing, every one of you has heard a story of trauma. Probably all of you have heard about people who were bullied, and that bullying has a giant impact. We're learning that now, right? The last several years, we've really seen what is the impact of social trauma. Everyone has been excluded on some level or another. There's all kinds of research showing that exclusion actually causes physical pain. And, you know, many folks that are older had the experience of being institutionalized back when institutions were just horrendous. And there were experiences of abuse, of neglect, and really horrific situations. So trauma is the elephant in the room. And when I started being able to just do therapy and write therapeutic behavior plans, which were a little bit different, and we could focus on what folks needed emotionally, we just heard one trauma story after another. And that's when I figured out that I better learn about trauma. I mean, I have my own, but that's all of us. Planet Earth isn't that easy. But yeah, it's time for me to get educated. And so I studied and looked, and I was able to get trained in EMDR, eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing, and I've done that for 20 years with folks with disabilities and found a lot of great results with that. But also what I learned was that we had to address things programmatically. Next slide. Because the reality is that when we're talking about behaviors, we're often talking about symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the statistics show us the unbelievable level of abuse that has occurred in the lives of many people with intellectual disabilities. So the Spectrum Institute in 2013 published a study. They surveyed over 7,600 people and asked, have you been sexually, physically, or financially abused? And out of that group, 70% said they had been abused, 90% said it had been ongoing, and yet only 37% reported it to the authorities. And way less than that got any kind of treatment. I was so fortunate to be a part of an NPR series and meet Joe Shapiro, who is just a brilliant journalist and writer. He wrote the book No Pity, and he went to the Bureau of Statistics in 2018 and said, can you please publish a report about the sexual abuse, sexual assaults on every level that have been reported on people with intellectual disabilities versus people without? And what they did that for him, and then they came back to him and they said people with intellectual disabilities are 7 times more likely to be sexually abused. And I just hate saying that with families. And because we know the bullying exists, we know the exclusion exists, and we have to really inoculate and help people, protect them against trauma. And one way that we have to protect people against trauma, I believe, and against the trauma of sexual abuse, is to really teach and support positive love relationships. Because when people are isolated, what happens is, next slide, what we call, well, here's the trauma of exclusion. They're excluded from the rest of the world when we isolate them, and that actually increases the effects of any trauma. Connection is really important in the healing process. And next slide after that, betrayal trauma. So really quickly, this one young woman that I work with who wants me to tell her story has shared with me actually a situation that I'm so sorry to say I've dealt with many times. I can think of at least 7 cases where I was brought in to do crisis counseling. So this woman always wanted a boyfriend, had somebody at the day program that she liked, but his mother wouldn't allow him to date, right? And so she wanted a boyfriend very badly. She got some alone time and she was able to start walking around her neighborhood. She was very happy. And somebody saw her and started trailing her, then offering her rides, then grooming her. And then he brutally assaulted her. But what was so impactful was when she reported it, but she said, but he was my boyfriend, so it's okay if it hurt, because that was my boyfriend. And that was what she had always wanted. So tragically, we hadn't prepared her, we hadn't coached her and helped her to have a boyfriend. to have someone visiting her home, to have someone in her room, to learn about every aspect of love in a way that she could access. So she was that much more vulnerable to abuse. So, and the impact of the trauma is something I've seen many times in therapy as a therapist working with folks, that the abuse was bad, but what was worse was the betrayal. I thought that was my boyfriend. I worked with another woman years ago who thought that the staff was her boyfriend. And when she found out that he was married and every night what he was doing to her was called rape, she was shattered. She said, I thought we were going to get married. And that's what we have to open our eyes to, how to inoculate people against trauma, how to help them to be a part of this world, and how to really access treatment. So I'm so excited to turn this over to Tanya, who will encourage us that healing happens, and everything she has to say is very inspiring, because I've been able to collaborate with her and Michael Small, and they've just taken it to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I'm not sure my speaker is working. There it is. I've learned so much from Karen, and I just wanted to say thank you to you as well, and certainly from my partner, Michael Small. But so much of what I've learned from Karen really about the intersection between trauma-informed practices and person-centered care, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. We really want to make sure that we are assuming trauma and that people who are planning with folks know that that might be a part of a person's history. So we need ways to account for the presence of trauma in our person-centered plans, because those who are trauma survivors need more than treatment. They need to live in settings that support healing. And if we do good person-centered planning and discovery, we can understand not only the impact that the trauma has had, but how to describe a supportive environment that helps them heal. So the need to address trauma is increasingly viewed as an important component of effective person-centered planning and service delivery. And we don't need to assume that someone needs to be a therapist to be therapeutic. So with person-centered planning, what we do is encourage and focus on relationship building and trust building, and also accurately reflecting the balance from the person's perspective. But we really want to make sure that only trained clinical staff should uncover the what, the where, and the when details about the trauma. So adding these trauma-informed discovery questions to person-centered discovery can really help us do that. Person-centered discovery is usually conducted during planning and whenever we're supporting people, so that we can understand from their perspective the balance between what's important to them and what's important for them. And the kinds of supports that they appreciate to have that balance in their life. But those events and experiences that may have traumatized them in the past, those distressing events may stay with them for a very long time and have long-lasting and harmful effects on their physical health, their emotional health, and their well-being. And that can result in them feeling not safe, not in control of themselves, or disconnected from themselves and others. So adding questions around what safety means to them, how does the person need and have power and control in their life, and what connections in their life would contribute to healing are important person-centered questions to add. Next slide, please. A person-centered plan always helps us then describe that balance from the person's perspective, the balance between what's important to them and what's important for them, and the things at the core of the person that keep them happy and comforted and satisfied and fulfilled, in balance with the things that they need to be healthy, safe, and valued. But those additional questions, we can learn what makes people feel safe. And safety might include things like creating spaces where people feel culturally safe, emotionally safe, physically safe, as well as an awareness of the discomfort they may be feeling or the unease. So good person-centered discovery might help us describe that and describe the supports that the person would need to avoid that. In addition to that, what they need in terms of transparency and trustworthiness. So what is it that helps them build and maintain trust with others? And with whom do they have trust? So there are person-centered skills that we might use to look at who's in the person's life and how they feel connected to them. How they make choices and the ways in which the trauma that they may have experienced impacts the choices that they make. And then also collaboration and mutuality. So we might use a skill like a donut sort, which is a person-centered skill that helps us understand roles and responsibilities in a person's life, so that we can understand where they feel that they have power with others in decision-making, and shared power versus a power over them where someone is telling them what to do or making decisions for them. Because we know that healing only happens in situations where people feel that they share power with others. Next slide, please. The reason we thought this quote might be important to share with you today is really we want any person who's in a planning role to understand that trauma might be a part of a person's history, and that we should assume trauma and know where to turn when we find that that's so. So when people feel responsible for handling some situation in which in fact they are largely helpless, that creates in them a dangerous combination of feelings, and that can lead to abuse. And when I think of it from a purely planning perspective, that really could be an overreach of power or an overreach of control that would prevent a person from having a life where they have the supports that help them feel that they are in balance between those things that are important to them and important for them. Next slide. So trauma can be complex, and there's no expectation that someone who's in a planning role should be digging deeply into trauma with people. But we do need to understand that we may uncover it, and we do not need to dig for it unless we're trained to respond to it. But when it does come up, we need to understand how to help people connect to the resources that they need to deal with it. We also need to understand that in planning, it has an impact on the choices people make, and on the way that they communicate, and also on their behavior in a daily basis. So it's helpful to know what it is that sets people off and how to talk about it with them. And we might use some of our person-centered skills like a communication chart to help us understand that when we see certain things, what would the person like us to do in response to them? And that helps us learn what support works best for the person and make sure that that shows up in their plans, and that everyone who's working with them understands what they should or should not do in response to things that they're seeing. We also want to make sure that that's a part of the discovery process for every person that we're working with. Next slide, please. So we want to make sure that when we're planning with people as well, that related to being transparent and trustworthy, if we're going to build and maintain trust, that we need to act on what we hear. So we don't, if we've uncovered trauma and we've got supports in place in the plan, it's not good enough just to have it on paper. It really needs to be showing up in a person's life, and the people who are supporting them need to know what to do and how to act on the things that have been identified. So we want to make sure that plans that are written with folks are implemented in a way that don't represent a broken promise, because we don't plan just for planning in and of itself. It really is about helping people have good lives. Otherwise, what we've done is devalued the importance of the person and their experience, and we want to avoid that at all costs. Next slide. So person-centered trauma-informed plans help us create an approach to support where people are feeling safe and accepted and respected. And we learned that if we use good trauma-informed practices with person-centered practices, that they really can make a difference in helping people feel supported and have more balance in their life. So I'm going to turn this over to Amy and let her talk to you a little bit now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am, just like Karen said, I'm absolutely delighted to be a part of this panel today. And today we're going to be talking about my son's story. Again, it is my son's story, and I want everyone to know that I have his permission to share his story. He is a strong advocate for himself and for others, and he understands how valuable it is that we share how we helped him heal from trauma that was induced in the school setting, and how we've empowered him to be someone that advocates for himself. So our story started in 5th grade. He had the same paraprofessional since 1st grade. They had a wonderful relationship. She was kind, she was loving. She really could anticipate my son's needs before he even had to vocalize what he wanted. And then when 5th grade came around, there were some changes in the school district where he was no longer able to have that same paraprofessional. So we had a change in support. And this was in itself pretty traumatic, but at that point I didn't really have any knowledge of trauma. I didn't really do a good job of preparing him for this big change in his school life. So what we started to see in 5th grade was that there were some changes in his behavior. So he started cursing and yelling at school. We never had any behavior issues, you know, in quotes, before this. He started running away from the classroom. He started refusing to work. And so my mind just kind of went to, oh, it's 5th grade. The work is more challenging at this time. Oh, he's going through puberty. So now we have all these hormones that are going, and that's making some changes. And then we started to see some self-injurious behaviors, and he started to pull away from his friends. So he was chasing people away in the playground. He wouldn't let anybody interact with him. Next slide, please. So these changes in behavior then led to threats that he was going to harm other people at school. They began restraining him at school, and then finally we started to have aggressive behaviors at home. Again, we'd never had anything like this before. I was just beginning my journey into person-centered thinking at the time, and so I had a basic one-page profile created for him, and I was trying to use the information that I had gathered at that time to support him, but we had a typical response, a typical school response to that behavior. So, you know, they did a functional behavior analysis. We came up with a behavior intervention plan. I had this wonderful idea of creating a goal where we were going to force him to play with other kids. You know, oh, well, he just needs more social skills, right? The social skills are going to help him not chase people away. And of course, that was not helpful whatsoever, right? The behaviors got worse. And school ended, we were in summer. He was in summer camp, the same camp he'd been going to for 2 years. And at camp, he still continued to have these aggressive behaviors and eventually was kicked out of camp for biting an adult. And this happened while I was at the Portland Gathering. And at the Portland Gathering, I had the honor to hear Karen Harvey speak. And Karen Harvey was speaking about trauma-informed practices and care. And she put up her slide that spoke about the big T and little t of trauma. And then I started bawling. And I just started crying and crying and crying. And I went up to Karen after her talk and I said, this is what's going on with my son, right? It's the little t. And it was my own definition of trauma that kept me from seeing that, because my son wasn't physically abused at school. Yes, he was restrained, but it was a short restraint. You know, he wasn't held down for long periods of time. And so in my mind, I didn't see that as being traumatizing, again, because I'm thinking big T trauma, not little t. So he was being excluded from the classroom because of the behaviors. So he was in general education, but he was in a table separate from everyone else so that it would be easier for someone to be able to take him away. So what happened was I was able to go observe in the classroom after he finally started saying that he wanted to harm other people. And I saw that the paraprofessional that was working with him, really, the way she spoke to him was very demeaning. The supports that we had put in place to help him, such as going out into the hallway in order to calm down, became in the hallway now, you know, with just a very stern tone of voice. He wasn't allowed to be different whatsoever. So if he wanted to get up and walk around, it was sit down, you know, stay still, pay attention. Next slide, please. And so I realized that those behaviors, the way that person was supporting him, had caused trauma. And after hearing Karen speak, I realized that I had to take it upon myself to truly listen to my son. And instead of asking, you know, why are you doing this? ask him what's really bothering you so we can really get to the root of the matter. Next slide, please. And so this is a slide, if you've taken person-centered thinking, this was a slide that really hit it for me, right? So their relationship was not a supportive relationship. She was fixing him. She was fixing every behavior that he had. The response was, how do we stop this behavior instead of how do we understand this behavior? And even though we did a functional behavior analysis, even that was looking at, there was a typical response. Oh, well, he's running away from math because he's trying to avoid doing math. He doesn't like math class. You know, oh, he's doing this. He's having self-injurious behaviors because he wants attention, right? And we weren't really stopping to think, why is he doing these things? And so I realized that it was that power over him that she had, that relationship. And so I was able to make some changes at school where I said, this person is no longer allowed to support my son. We need someone else. We used a matching profile, which is a tool that we use in person-centered thinking to really kind of find somebody that would work well for him. And so we based it off of his previous support person. So I wanted someone that was a grandmother-y type person. I wanted someone that was soft-spoken. I wanted someone that would see that they were a team, and we gave them that language of, we're a team, we need to work together in order to help you at school. Next slide, please. And you've already seen this slide, but this was another one of those slides that really, really hit home. And so I knew that my son, even though he may have been in a classroom where it was a supportive environment, he had, you know, teachers that were still kind to him, the fact that this individual was with him all day created a toxic environment everywhere he went. And so the work that we had to do was, I realized that a supportive environment wasn't enough. So we had to place him in a healing environment. So he was able to get some counseling. And then we used this slide when we had our staffing meeting for 6th grade. We sat down and he was there with me, and we sat down and we spoke to about 15 people that were in his team. And I explained, you know, academics are important, but our goal for this year is to help him recover from this trauma that occurred at school. And these are the 3 things that we need to focus on to help create that healing environment for him. Next slide, please. So this is my son's 1-page profile. This is what it looked like before I had any knowledge of trauma-informed supports. And it has some pretty good information in there, but it was all very basic and pretty superficial. So of course I know the great things about my son, and that's on there. And I knew that he needed frequent breaks and that positive reinforcements worked well for him. And I know that he preferred for people to speak to him in a calm tone of voice. Next slide, please. But this is what it looks like now. So if you see him, there he is. He's got a full face. He's got his lovely beard, which he's very proud of, his mustache. He's 14, but looks like he's, you know, almost a grown man. And we've learned now all these different things, right, through discovery. And this is not me sitting down and saying, you know, Ty, tell me, how do you feel safe at school? It's us driving to school during the day and just having regular conversations. And when he talks to me, I actually listen to him and I ask follow-up questions. And when he's telling him about his day, you know, I'll ask, well, how did you feel in that moment? You know, what happened? Did the way that person responded help? Right? And I was able to gather a lot more detailed information that we share with everyone who supports him. So it doesn't matter if you're not his teacher. If you're his bus driver, you have this 1-page profile. I make it a point that the school resource officer, which is a police officer at school, that they know who my son is. They know these great things about my son, right? He is empathetic. He is respectful. He is responsible. And if you happen to see him on a bad day, that's what I want you to remember. I don't want you to see a 14-year-old who is the size of a grown man as somebody who's physically threatening. I want you to see a young man who's struggling because he's in fight or flight at this moment. And these are the ways that you can support him, right? So they know that you're going to come speak to him in a calm tone of voice. They know that he loves geography and he loves foreign languages. So if he's upset and he's starting to cool down, if you come and talk about geography, chances are you're going to be able to help him calm down. Versus if you come in with an attitude of, what's going on here? What are you doing? Right, with that authoritative voice. Next slide, please. So then some of the things that we discovered were that being called Christopher was a trigger for him. And it was never a trigger before. He never had any issues with being called Christopher. And that went back to the way that particular person responded to him, right? So that name was used in a threatening tone, you know, in the hallway now. And so initially, several years ago, if you would call him Christopher, it was an automatic trigger, fight or flight would kick in. He would be extremely upset. And now, after about 3 years of us working with him, you know, if you say Christopher, he's going to say, please call me Ty, right? So he's worked to be able to help himself realize it's okay. Somebody called me that name. I'm just going to tell him, please call me Ty. And we also know that it's extremely important for people to speak to him in a calm voice and tone. And that's something that I get a lot of pushback on, right? I work in a school. I'm a teacher. Some teachers, that's just the way they manage their classroom, right? They yell. And they tell me that that's not realistic. That's not real life. And I get that point of view. I understand that. And I tell them, I'm not going to ask the world to walk on eggshells and whisper around my son, but I need you to create a healing environment in your classroom. And what that requires from you is for you to remember that this is a trigger. And if you give him a warning ahead of time, Ty, I'm about to raise my voice, you know, cover your ears. Or Ty, something's going on. I need to raise my voice. He's okay. If you can't give him that notice, that's okay too, because you just need to check back with him and explain why that tone was used. Because it doesn't matter if it's not directed at him. Because of who he is and how he wants to protect everyone now, any child you speak to in that tone of voice, he's going to step up and he's going to say, that's not how you talk to people, right? So if you're able to do those things and you have taken the time to develop that relationship and he has that trust with you, then that trust is not broken when you raise your voice or if you yell, you know, if you speak sternly with him. So that's one of the biggest ones that I get pushback on. And you know, at the beginning of the year, it's always pretty stressful. We kind of have some, you know, responses of, well, this is going on in the classroom. And then usually we go, okay, well, have you been doing this, right? And months down, you know, they're like, oh, you know, it actually works. So it's always great to see months later when people actually realize if you actually follow these things, it really works. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. So building those connections is absolutely vital. And it can be little things like greeting him when he walks into the classroom. And that's something that a lot of schools already do. You hear about all these different programs, capturing kids' hearts and things like that. But that means everybody in your classroom, right? So my son is not a visitor, he is your student. And I want him to know that you care that he's there that day. If he was sick the day before, you say, hey, we missed you, right? And his classmates also interact with him and they say, hi, Ty, you know, it's great to have you here today. He's included. He has opportunities to show that he's a leader. He gets to stand up and present to the classroom, right? He's not just a bystander. He's an active person in your classroom. One of the biggest ones for him is, he tells us if he's had a rough day, he wants you to tell him that he's still a good person. Because when he goes into fight or flight, and this is pretty frequent for a lot of people, right? There's that shame afterwards that I've lost control. And he gets really upset when he loses control. And that's one of the problems that we have sometimes, is that people who support him say, oh, well, you know, he comes and he talks to me about he had a rough day, and he always says he knows what to do. And I said, yeah, that's right. And that's exactly how you know he's in fight or flight, right? Because in that moment, he was not able to stop and think, I need to do X, Y, Z. It's afterwards when he is calm and he can talk about it. And it's important for him to be able to process that. So he keeps learning, right? To be able to respond in the way that he wants to respond, because he doesn't like losing control. Next slide, please. When we're talking about empowerment, right, it's not always big changes, right? It's a lot of little things, right? So for him, helping him to identify what he was feeling. We used a program called the Zones of Regulation. So he had visuals of what does this emotion look like? What does this emotion feel like? And all emotions are valid. It's not saying you are not allowed to get angry, right? It's, yes, people get angry, and this is what you can do to help yourself calm down. And these are the words that you need to tell us that you're starting to feel unsafe. And so I've taught him to say, I feel unsafe, I need a break, right? It's helping him think through his problems rather than fixing. And I am a mom, and I love to fix things. And when I started learning more about person-centered thinking and getting my certification, that was something that I really had to work on myself, right? Because we are change targets, right? We are change agents, but we are also change targets. And that was one of the biggest things that I had to change in myself, was not to fix things for him, but to empower him to learn how to fix things for himself. And one of the other ones that we really worked on was getting them to change their view of supporting and teaching versus punishing. So if he's in your classroom and you're yelling and he's triggered and you're writing him a slip for detention, right? If I can't get you to change that, then I need that detention to mean something. I need that detention to be a time when you're working with him to work on your relationship. You're working with him to understand, you know, what happened, what can we do differently? And again, it needs to be something that they work on together. It's not the teacher telling him, you need to change this. It's them having a conversation. Ty, what can I do to change? What can you do to change so that we can have a better experience when we're together? Next slide, please. So these are one of the things that we do to help him form those relationships a little bit quicker, right? So they have tons of information on my son, and he knows absolutely nothing about them. So before school starts, we have his teachers fill out, it's almost like a one-page profile on them. And we have the questions on there. If he met you on the street, these are the things he would ask you about. He would ask you about your kids or your grandkids, or what do you like to do for fun? He loves to talk about traveling around the world. And so he wants to know where people want to go, right? So if they take the time to fill this out, then we review it before school starts, and he knows something about them. He has something to start off with. And if he's having a rough day with a particular teacher, I can say, hey, remember Mrs. So-and-so got to go to Germany, right? And so it humanizes the teacher. And then I love how they get an opportunity to tell him, right, how he can support them at school. Next slide, please. So when I'm talking about discovery, it's not just what people tell us, right? It's not words, it's behavior. And with my son, it's his drawings and the things that he writes. He is a prolific artist. He loves to draw things. This was something that, the basketball drawing is something that he made probably about 4 years ago. Now looking at this drawing, and if you wouldn't mind in the chat box asking me, what would you say is something that is important to Ty? Something that makes him happy, comforted, fulfilled? Do you have any thoughts on something that would be important to him? Perfect. Yes, encouragement, positive praise, friends who are happy for him. Right, perfect. Those are the correct answers. Now, I didn't see anybody say basketball, but one of the reasons that I use this as an example is because we need to not make assumptions, right? So if you made an assumption that basketball is important to my son, you would be wrong. He absolutely hates sports. I was very surprised that he drew this because he never really ever played basketball. But if you see us up there, that's me and my husband and his brother with the glasses, right? We're all cheering him on, and his little bubble, right? I know I can do this, right? That's him internalizing what he's telling himself. And I actually have a video of him in karate where he did his entire kata and then he bowed out. And in the video, he goes, I did it, right? So yes, positive praise, encouragement is really important to him. Now looking at his room rules, what would you say is an underlying theme for his room rules?
And if you're typing into chat, be sure to select all panelists and attendees if you want to, if you want everybody to see your responses, which is nice.
So these room rules constantly change. He has numerous on his door. Respect, respect. Oh my God, you guys are amazing. Yes, respect is the underlying theme of his rules, right? I donated a toy one time when he was about 8 years old, and I will never be allowed to forget that. He's never gonna let me live that down, right? But respect is very, very important to my son and important for my son. Next slide, please. And how do I know that these changes that we've made are working, right? Again, he is showing me with his behavior, but he's also showing me with the things he writes, right? So he likes Miss Hinojosa because she reminds him of his good behavior in the past. So she knew if he had a rough day, it was okay. He was still a good kid. And he wrote that on, I think it was like an English thing he had to do. He wrote a thank you note for one of his teachers. I enjoy your respect. These are all his words. Nobody prompted him to write any of this. This other piece of paper is also an assignment, and it was for this time of the year. What are you thankful for? Right? He was thankful for friends, his teachers, his school, right? His parents. He would not have written that down in 5th grade. School would not be on there. Friends would not be on there, right? So we see that growth is definitely there. Another way that I know it's working is the way everyone is responding to when my son goes in fight or flight or when he's having a rough day. And this year I've had several examples. One was where he was running in the hallway and his karate teacher used his loud karate teacher voice to tell him to stop running. And he was on the way to his class. And so for the rest of the class, he was very quiet. And then when he got home, he told me what happened. And he was very upset and he was very hurt. And instead of letting that brew and make him upset, he asked me to email his teacher. And I tried to get him to do it. And he said, no, I want you to do it, Mom, but I'll tell you what to say. And so he told him that he felt like their trust was broken because of the way he spoke to him, and that he needed some time to think about things before they could talk about it. And so if he saw him the next day, that he probably wouldn't talk to him, and just to give him time. And he kept asking me every 5 minutes, did he respond? Did he respond? And the next morning, the teacher responded. And he responded in the absolute best way he possibly could have. You know, he apologized to Ty for raising his voice. He told Ty that he was really sorry, that he thought that something had broken their trust, but that he would do whatever Ty needed him to do to build that relationship back up. And he said, you know, we don't have to talk about it until you're ready. And then when Ty saw that, he saw that this person truly cared about him, right? He apologized. He understood that what he did upset him. And he said, you know, Mom, and this is the language he uses. He says, I feel neutral about it now. So when he feels neutral about something, he's okay to talk. He hasn't forgiven you or anything, but he's not so upset that he can't talk about it. So he said, I feel neutral about it, and I think I'll go talk to him tomorrow morning. In the past, he was upset with my sister at one point, and that led to months of him not talking to her. And this is someone who he loves and who he trusts. But because of where he was several years ago, it took him months to get that back. And now he's at a point where if he knows that person truly cares about him, he's able to give them another chance. And that's huge. And I think we just have his video so you can hear his words. So he is a very strong self-advocate. This is a video that he created for some students that were working to become paraprofessionals, and this was his advice.
A good paraprofessional is someone that listens to what the person is saying, listens to what I'm saying is, a good paraprofessional listens to what someone has to say and think before they speak or act, and hold your temper. Try to hold your temper when you're in a situation. Hold your temper, not lose your temper. Be polite and kind, and no yelling at the student, or losing your temper towards the student. And always listen, and help him or her calm down whenever he or she is upset.
So there you go. Those are his words. Doing what we've been doing for the past couple of years using person-centered practices and trauma-informed care has helped him to grow into a very strong self-advocate and advocate for others. I'm sorry, Kathy, take it away.
Thank you for having me here and including me in this panel. I've learned so much just listening to everyone. So part of what I like to think about in my work is this intersection between trauma-informed work and culturally informed work. And so much of the time, we miss opportunities to really be person-centered, to really think about, a whole person and all of the pieces. And sometimes it's because we're so aware of kind of who we are and how we operate in the world that we don't always think about what are the experiences of others who are outside of the lanes we're in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those things and really appreciating this entire conversation today. And thank you again for so much. Next slide, please. So we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. And again, so much of what we've heard today really speaks to this. It's really understanding that based on what we're experiencing and what we have experienced, we see the world in so many other kinds of ways. And it may be very different from the person who's next to us. It may be very different from, someone who's even in our own homes. So really, again, wanting to create opportunities for us to share information, to think about. It's not just walking in someone else's shoes. It's understanding that everyone's shoes takes them to a different place. and that a friend of mine said once, you never step in the same river twice. So even if I've had the same experience, how I'm experiencing it now may be different. So again, it's just kind of opening up our conversation a little bit around what does it mean to be culturally informed, and how does that connect to being trauma-informed and healing-informed? A couple of things I'd like us also to think about is that for many of us in the work that we do, we provide care, and that care is given with kindness, and many of our families that we're working with and connecting with come from places of kindness. And for others, those experiences don't feel that way. So the language of being trauma-informed gets tossed around a lot. And so what I like to talk about is trauma-informed approaches, and I really love the language of person-centered thinking. So it's bringing these pieces together to kind of think a little bit more around what else can we do and how can we broaden this conversation. Next slide, please. So culture is what unifies us. And there's all of the traditions, all of the beliefs and values that we have, ways of looking at the world. And then there's how do we connect to one another? How do we form groups and really operate in ways where we are connected? And so we've been hearing, throughout this conversation, how important connection is. And yet for many of us, connecting is extremely difficult, even in settings where connection is supposed to be part of what people have access to. So I've spent a lot of my years, especially early in my career, working in settings with folks who have intellectual disabilities. My very first experiences in education, I was in 6th grade, my brother was in a special education class, and that teacher invited me to come into her room as a helper. So I learned very, very early on, and then all through my junior high school, she allowed me to come back. So I spent years as an assistant, as a learner, in a special education classroom with a teacher who understood trauma when the rest of us didn't have language for it. And of course I went to school to be a teacher, and of course I was going to teach. And my very first job, excuse me, out of school, I worked in a developmental center. And one of the challenges is that, this was in the very early days of these large institutions, and there was not a lot of care, not a lot of kindness. And I was part of a group of people who was hired to change that. And so I was able to create this classroom environment. And the first value is everyone has suffered. The second is we honor that suffering. And the third was we alleviate that suffering. And so the entire classroom environment and my very first teaching job was really about creating spaces that provided physical and emotional safety. And that meant really trying to convey to folks that physical and emotional safety look like something, and that has meaning. And this was happening in an environment where physical and emotional safety were not necessarily the priority of lots of folks who worked there. So it was life-changing work for me. And it was also another arena where we were talking about trauma, and yet no one was talking about culture. So I always felt that, these conversations needed to come together, and they need to come together in ways that make sense, that honors everyone's experience, and treats everyone as a human in need of both physical and emotional safety, and then really, really willing to work to create that. Next slide, please. So to start, I had to think about, well, what is identity and what is culture, and how do these things matter? So I'm going to ask folks to go ahead and, in the chat box, if you're willing, to list out ways that you identify yourself. I happen to be an African-American woman. I happen to be a grandma. I happen to be mom. I happen to be a lot of things. I happen to be someone who identifies as a lesbian, and yet when folks are looking at me, of course, you can only tell certain parts of my identity. So all of these conversations about identity are not on the table right? And so if we don't create openings for them, we assume lots of things. It came up earlier around, not really talking with folks about relationships and what does a healthy and trustworthy and safe relationship look like. And so we miss opportunities to support people to, one, be safe, two, to ask for and seek relationships that are mutual, that are trustworthy, where people feel that things are real and genuine. And again, these are conversations we may tend not to have. So without these conversations, there's myths, there's assumptions, and there's stereotypes. And one of the stereotypes is that folks who have intellectual disabilities don't need to talk about identity, don't need to talk about culture, don't need to talk about sexuality, don't need to talk about a lot of things that are very easy places where safety is violated, where their sense of belonging and connection gets violated. So if we're going to be trauma informed, we really need to and must, I say, deepen the conversations around real connections about who I am, about what's important, and about what does growth and healing look like for each and every one of us. So it's opening up this opportunity to engage in conversation about not just who's in your family, but the values around what's important. Who are my folks in my community, in my neighborhoods that are important to me? Who are the folks that feel safe and what makes them feel safe? Who are the folks who open up opportunities for growth and connection? Again, both in classrooms and at home, and then in our broader communities as a whole. And so it's really, again, are there ways that we can broaden that conversation so that identity is something that we're all talking about, not just someone deciding, yes, it's good for some of us to talk about and not for others. And I think it really does loom large when we start to talk about trauma and its impact, and the ways that people are included or excluded, and in the ways that we believe in folks' potential for growth and healing. Next slide, please. So culture matters in so many ways, right? It matters in terms of what we experience and the sense we make of it. So when in my family, when I could talk about traumatic things that happened to me, even though siblings had had some traumatic experiences, it didn't make the same sense to them. It didn't matter in the same ways to them. And it was all important. It's just that as we talk about physical abuse and sexual abuse and emotional abuse and the ways that power and control are used over others, we might not all have the same language to describe it. So we need to have conversations to get at that. Culture matters and what we find helpful and healing. That, when I train in person, I will often ask the group, how did you learn to treat a common cold? And the answers are so all over the place, from, you get some Vicks and you rub it on your chest and you drink, and you have chicken soup and you drink lots of juice, to, we slice onions and we put them on the side of the bed and they soak up the germs in the room. Or we do things with garlic, or we drink tea. Like there's all these different ways that folks will talk about what's helpful and healing. And yet, when we provide services and supports to folks, we often have one way that we think about doing that. So I loved, what was kind of opened up for us earlier in terms of the one pager and that second version of it, that loom, that had such deeper meaning. I think we also have to add some conversations around what's helpful and what's healing, related to culture and connection, right? Culture often determines whether or not we feel respected and understood. So we've talked about that today as a cornerstone of person-centered approaches, and yet we don't all find the same thing respectful, And we also don't provide, when we're in helping roles, we might not think about, are there other ways to ask these questions? So, you know, who's in your family that matters, and what would they think about what respect looks like? I love the one pager on helpers. You know, we are often used to expecting folks to tell us everything about themselves. And then we use that information in all kinds of ways. I love the idea of those of us who are in the helping roles to be able to held accountable to share things about ourselves. What does it mean for us to feel respected and understood? And that we respect each other by having those be two-way conversations. And often, excuse me, when we're looking at and talking about whether someone is being trustworthy, that's often connected to whether or not someone feels genuine. And for me, that is incredibly culturally based. I mean, everything I learned from my siblings, from my parents, that fueled this conversation around, is that person being real with you? Sometimes when folks are in classrooms or there's this power dynamic, you know, that helpers are providing a service, that those in the helping position don't allow questioning about what does it mean for us to be genuine. So there's this balance of conversation here that needs to be looked at in terms of, in the same way many of us are traumatized, whether we are people who are providing services or receiving services. I'm a trauma survivor. My children are trauma survivors. And I talk about this in so many different kinds of ways. As a provider, as an administrator, as someone who's, you know, been in different kinds of clinical settings where I've been supported by others, in peer support where I've been supported by other trauma survivors. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that we show up for each other. And sometimes when it comes to thinking about folks who have intellectual disabilities, there's limits to how much energy goes into conversation about respect and dignity and what it feels like when someone's being genuine with you. And so that's gold for us to mine, and can deeply shift how we think about relationships. That often education and service provision is from this top-down way. And if we can shift that to be more mutual, can we shift that to be more of an explanation of what it is that we all bring to the table, and how are we sharing our stories, our cultural stories, our parenting stories, our values stories, our trauma stories, in ways that make sense and in those moments. Can I have the next slide, please? So culture also influences some things in terms of how behavior is interpreted by others. And, you know, in a lot of the settings where I've worked, one of the things that doesn't get talked a lot about is that we know disparities exist. We know that when people have any kind of challenge that pushes them to the margins, that their voice is often seen as less important, their experience is often seen as less than, and the ways that they're responded to is often problematic. When we have people of color, as an example, who are also experiencing these same kinds of challenges, disparities loom even larger. So part of our conversation is really important for us to think about that there's a likelihood that trauma is part of the picture, and that it's extremely high, like that it's likely that trauma, for anyone who's in a service setting, trauma is part of what they experience in that service setting. So I often have this slide that I share that lists all these potential sources of trauma, from physical abuse and emotional abuse, things that happen in childhood, neglect, to bullying, to hate crimes in community, to natural disasters, to the ways that people are sexually assaulted, domestic violence, the things that happen to human beings where our capacity to cope is overwhelmed. So when we talk about those things, we often leave out parts of our populations that are also experiencing those things. And one of the examples that actually came up today, and Amy, thank you so much for that, about how this person who was supposed to be supportive was doing so much harm, right? When we can think about that there's trauma that comes from people who may be well-intentioned, people who may be unaware of how they're wielding their formal authority, that people who are using power and control, and it could be a person, it could be a whole group of people, and they're using that power and control over others. That could also be any one of us. So not being aware doesn't give us a pass. Not understanding doesn't make it right. So we have to think about how we layer in our understanding of disparities, of hate crimes, of the things that happen to humans because of what they look like, who they look like, how they show up, how people are marginalized. And it's really important for us to be able to build that into our understandings and conversations. Next slide, please. So when we make sense of traumatic experiences, it's really important for us to think about there are things that individuals experience that overwhelm our capacities to cope. And then there are collective and historical experiences that are part of every day for many of us. And that there are legacies of racism, there are legacies of sexism, there are legacies of whole communities being marginalized. And so we have to bring those perspectives and conversations into our everyday work as we think about person-centered planning and what is it that folks will find helpful. Next slide, please. So another way to look at this, and for those who have some, maybe using a reader, I want to just explain this chart a little bit in case it's not showing up the way you need it to. So we all have ways that we identify ourselves, and we have ways that we're connected to trusted others. So there's a circle in the middle here that's about self-identity, and that's for each and every one of us and how we connect. There's also the circle outside of that self-identity circle that's really linked to how we connect to trusted others. And then there are experiences that disrupt those connections. So history and legacies of violence that impact communities of color, that impact communities of First Nations folks, that impact folks who are maybe immigrants, that impact folks who are women, that impact folks who are who have disabilities. Like there's all of these historical experiences over generations that impact who we are and how we are even with ourselves. There's experiences with violence, and then there's community experiences, which includes many of the things we've been talking about already today. But then in the organizations where we work and where we go to school, there are behaviors and attitudes that are also deeply troubling, deeply disconnecting, and deeply marginalizing. So as we're thinking about what it means to be person-centered in our planning, part of what we have to hold is that there are things that we do where we live, work, go to school, that things that happen to people who are present for services or present for education that are deeply disconnecting and doing more harm. Next slide, please. So as we try to navigate the impacts of trauma and think about, what might be happening for folks, is we can't assume that trauma is past, that there are things that are happening every day, day in and day out, that are impacting how people are connecting to themselves and to others. There are also things that are happening in our services, again, that are problematic. That when we think about how people who have intellectual disabilities, who are struggling with other kinds of challenges related to mental health, that there are rules and norms and expectations about how people should behave. And sometimes we do a lot of shoulding and a lot of shaming and have a lot of expectation about how people should behave, while all the while they're under siege. So we have to think about and also teach about, as we're thinking about person-centered planning, who's making the rules that folks have about how they should behave? How are we supporting people to report when trauma happens? Where do the rules come from about the shoulds and shouldn'ts, and that we need to keep those conversations active? Planning needs to bolster resilience and really help us think about, are there things that we're doing unintentionally that may be increasing someone's isolation? And then how do we support, in all of the ways we're supporting healing, making sure that we're talking about culture and that we're thinking about how we manage and navigate, and how are we teaching folks about their own right to emotional safety. Next slide, please. One last piece I want to talk about here very quickly as we're winding down is thinking about, are there things that we're doing where we're judging folks as worthy? Are we judging whether or not folks are innocent? Are they complicit? And we're judging people's capabilities. Everyone has a right to be taught about personal and emotional safety that is both physical and centered and grounded in their beliefs and values around culture, and their beliefs and values about what they deserve and how people should be treated. And to do that, those of us who are in helping roles or in roles where we have formal authority and power, we have to be able to kind of step outside of ourselves. And cultural humility means that we're learning about what's important to everyone else, and we're leveraging their beliefs and values above our own. Next slide, please. So some supports, things to incorporate. Thinking about peer support, attending to culture not necessarily as a goal, but a way that folks connect to each other and have opportunities to talk with people who have shared identities, shared meaning, and shared value, so that relationships can sustain over doubt, distance, and time. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to turn it over to Bevan if we have any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy, Amy, Tanya, Karen. So much material has been presented. We covered lots of ground and heard some amazing stories and pieces of information. So this is exciting. We do have a little time for questions. I'll start with a question that was typed into chat earlier on. And this is coming from a questioner who identifies as a traumatic brain injury. I was a person with traumatic brain injury who has experienced trauma. And this person asks, how can someone effectively communicate feedback to mental health or medical health care providers who do not practice trauma-informed care? How can we provide insight on areas for improvement? How can we promote trauma-informed care for those who may not be practicing that? I'd like to hear from I'm sure that our speakers, at least a few of you, have some thoughts on that. So don't be shy. You go ahead, Kathy. Okay. You look like you have an answer. Okay.
I always have something to say. I think one of the things is that there are lots of opportunities for information about trauma to be shared with healthcare providers. So some of those resources, there's a National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. There's a National Center on Futures Without Violence, does a lot of work on healthcare and trauma-informed approaches. So it's really thinking about, as a parent, I know my voice wasn't always heard in systems, whether it was with mental health providers and school systems, in terms of trauma-informed approaches, even when I have so much information. So I would always go prepared with, here's some information, here's some websites, here's some things I've learned. And so there's so much that we can, as parents, arm ourselves with as we go into situations. And so that's one of the things, is being able to show that there's real information, and that as both a helper and as a parent, making sure that we're talking with providers who can at least respect that we have a voice. So there's those two things. It's asking questions of them and saying, what do you know about trauma? Where are you gathering your information? And not shying away from asking questions of people who should know this stuff, who might not. And then going prepared with some resources to share.
Great, thank you, thank you. Any other thoughts from our other panelists on how to communicate about trauma-informed practices for providers who aren't practicing?
Well, I'm very inspired by Amy. This is Karen. Just because not only did she try to change and impact, you know, the way her son was being treated, she speaks, she advocates, her voice is heard. And I think that it's important for each one of us to understand how important our voice is, like Kathy said, and we've got to have that confidence to speak up in every situation and educate, you know, educate, speak, educate, write, talk. And I think all of us together trying to share in each situation when we're not heard and trying to really be heard, it will make the difference.
Great, thanks, Karen. I have a question for Tanya now. We had a request to just explain a little further about uncovering trauma versus knowing about trauma. This person noted that it's confusing because the person may be comfortable and disclose details.
I think I've unmuted myself.
You are, yeah.
Thank you. So what I was mentioning about uncovering trauma, when you're doing a discovery process, person-centered planning, having conversations, or just working with people on a daily basis, you might come by the information that there's trauma that's a part of a person's history, and it might be impactful of their behavior or the way they communicate or the way they make choices. Not every person is trained in how to best interact with people around trauma. So we need to know where to go to get further information, how to include that information in the planning process without digging into the where, when, and how. Not everybody needs to know that information, and it needs to be handled respectfully. But what we want to understand as well is that not everybody who's planning with people has that background at all. And I think that's something that comes up quite a lot with people who are using services and supports. And we can assume that most people who are just part of a service delivery system or a support delivery system have had some type of trauma. Not all of it is the big T trauma, as Kathy was saying, or as Karen would say. Some of it is the trauma of not being listened to, the trauma of repeated having people kind of make promises that don't get kept. All of those things can have an impact on someone. So we want to make sure that we're aware of that if we are planning with folks, and be aware also that people who are providing supports and services may also have trauma as part of their history.
Great. Thanks, Tanya. Question for Amy. How have you handled pushback, especially with teachers who might not be able to act out all of your suggestions and needs for your son when there are other students who may need the same amount of attention, or only one teacher, or limited support staff?
That's a great question, because that does happen. And so what we do is we just continue educating and saying, you know what, if you put in the work, it's going to end up being better for everybody. And yes, you may feel like this is taking time, but it's important that you do that. It's important that you take the time to build the relationship. And you know what? You don't have to do it just for my kid. There's no reason why you can't incorporate what you're doing with my son for everybody that's in your classroom, right? So it's not about disabilities. It's, yes, it's important if someone has trauma in their background to support them in this way, but just support everybody this way. There's absolutely no reason why you can't. One of the great things that we've seen is when we were in our final IEP meeting from 6th grade to 7th grade, where we were changing schools, we're speaking to the administrator of the next school via phone. The administrator of the current school got on and he said, Now I know you're going to look at this and you're going to think, you know, oh, we can't do this. But I promise if you do this, it will make a difference. And that to me was huge. One administrator to the other saying, just listen to her. Because we always have that struggle at the beginning of the year where people are saying, you know, yes, we don't have time to do this. And then he struggles, and then we have to go back and have conversations about why we do these things and how it's important that we all think of that triangle. Like, yes, academics are important, but he's not going to go anywhere academically if we can't help create a healing environment for him at school. And rarely do we have someone who doesn't buy into it. And those are the ones that see him for who he is, right? They don't see a kid that's cursing in the classroom or walking out. They're seeing someone who's having a tough day. I just had one of his teachers send me an email message telling me, you know, he came into my classroom. I saw he was having a rough day. And I told him he could draw because drawing is something that calms him. And I said, tomorrow we'll catch you up. So nobody was forcing him to calm down. Nobody was saying, you know, this is more important than what you're feeling right now. They were understanding. So just them realizing that it works and you're gonna have to take the time to do it.
Nice, thank you, Amy. So we've gotten a number of other awesome questions, and we won't have time to get to them. But we will work with the panelists as we do with all of our NCAPS webinars and see if we can get you some of these answers in written format, and we'll post them on the website in the next couple of weeks. So if we didn't get to your question, we got it, we recorded it, and we will and we'll work on getting it answered for you in the future. So stay tuned and keep an eye out for our MailChimp emails that will announce once everything has been posted. Just a couple of NCAPS updates before we wrap up. This Thursday, so just a couple days from now, 3 days from now, we will be holding a virtual listening session to gather feedback on the National Quality Forum's interim report on person-centered planning and practice. This is an effort that is separate from NCAPS but runs parallel to it. There's a group of experts who've been pulled together to create a draft definition of person-centered planning, draft competencies, and draft systems characteristics. That information has been posted on the National Quality Forum website. And if you're interested in joining us for a listening session just to gather your feedback on the draft report, join us at 2 o'clock Eastern with the link on your screen. This link is also available on our website, ncaps.acl.gov, as well as a link to get to that interim report. Our December webinar is scheduled, and it's focused on person-centered supports that honor safety and the dignity of risk. I think will be actually quite a nice companion to this webinar today. So please do plan to join us for that. Again, the registration information is going to be up on our site very soon. And then finally, we have a brain injury learning collaborative coming up soon. The information, there's some information on our website, or if you need it right away, you can email Connor. His email address is here if you're interested in participating in that. And you will be subscribed to our NCAPS mailing list, and you'll receive details about upcoming webinars unless you choose to unsubscribe. So please stay tuned for that as well. So now, Connor, if you could just put up the evaluation questions. We'll leave just a couple minutes before the end because we'd love for you to take time to answer the 7 questions on your screen. Just select what you can and give us feedback on these webinars. We do use this feedback to improve our webinars month to month. So we thank you for taking the time to complete this quick survey, and we'll leave it up as for the remainder of our time together. Finally, I'd like to just say big appreciation for Tanya Richmond, Karen Harvey, Kathy Cade, and Amy Ortiz Day. This discussion has been rich. I have learned a lot. Thank you so much. And I hope that those of you listening were able to find use in this, and hopefully can take this into all of the good work that you do to continue to make person-centered principles an aspiration, not just an aspiration, but a reality in your work as well. Good afternoon, everyone, and have a great day. Okay, great. I can leave. All right, I'm out.